All right, folks. I am going to get started. I want to get through the next chapter and be done with this section so we can be ready for the exam. All right, so we're talking about inflation again. So let's talk about who wins and who loses when there is inflation, when prices are fluctuating, in this case, in the positive direction. So the main reason inflation sometimes helps some people while hurting others in the economy is that economic transactions often involve contracts that extend over a period of time that are specified in nominal dollar terms. So nominal is the uninflation adjusted number. So again, real numbers adjust for inflation. We divide it by the price level to get the real number as far as like the wage and income goes. But contracts are specified in nominal terms, so they don't necessarily state changes in inflation, even though they try to project them and they try to include that in the calculations. So the interest rate that's generally included in a contract is vulnerable to inflation, changes in the price level. So the inflation rate itself is the price calculated as a percent of the amount borrowed that lenders charge to borrowers for use of their savings for 1 year, right? So you deposit your money in a bank. There's some interest rate that they give you in return for it. If you buy a bond, which is a promise, which is basically a loan. So you buy a bond. So whoever you buy the bond from, you're lending money to. And the bond carries a promise of you getting paid back what you paid plus some return, right? And that return is measured as like the interest rate times the principal, the amount that's paid. So what the dollar is worth in real terms, in terms of purchasing power, depends greatly on the rate of inflation over the intervening years of a loan. Economists summarize the effect of inflation on borrowers and lenders by distinguishing between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is the interest rate expressed in dollar terms, the interest rate that you'll see expressed like on a loan contract or like by a bank that you've deposited your savings in. The real interest rate is just the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So the real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. That's how you calculate the real interest rate. Each party to a loan contract has an expectation about the future rate of inflation and therefore an expectation about the real interest rate of the loan. If the actual rate, though, of inflation is higher than what's expected, borrowers will then repay their loans with funds that have a lower real value than has been expected. If the inflation is higher, then the funds that you're using to pay back are going to be worth less. If the actual inflation rate is lower than expected, then borrowers must repay their loans with funds that have a higher real value than was expected. So in modern America, home mortgages are the most important source of gains and losses from inflation. Americans who took out mortgages in the early 1970s quickly found that their real payments, their payments adjusted for inflation, reduced by higher than expected inflation. So by 1983, the purchasing power of a dollar was only 45% of what it had been in 1973. So because it was high inflation, the real value of the dollar decreased quite a bit, what a dollar could be exchanged for. In this case, 45% over a 10-year period. And therefore, like the amount, what you were paying your loans on that were specified in the loan contract 10 years prior is actually worth less than what you thought it would be. So you actually wind up paying more in real terms. So uncertainty about the future inflation rate discourages people from entering into any form of long-term contract. In countries with high and uncertain inflation, long-term loans are rare, which makes it difficult in many cases to make long-term investments. So investments are, and again, we talked about investment spending, which we'll talk about again in fine detail. But we talked about that as being like the spending by firms on things that will allow them to make future sales. And oftentimes that investment is is financed by savings of folks. And so these arrangements are set up in long-term contracts, but if the long-term contracts aren't willing to be even entered into because of like inflation and like therefore the unstable nature of like the actual value of what's being transacted, then that cuts off investment and that can hurt the economy. Unexpected deflation. So if prices are going down, then you're going to have deflation, which is a surprise fall in the price level, creates winners and losers as well. Between 1929 and 1933, as the U.S. economy plunged into the Great Depression, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI that we talked about, fell by 35% during that period. So again, that's something that could have happened to us post 2008 had things like gone into like that terrible of a state, to the extent that the U.S. was in back in the Great Depression era. So this meant that debtors, people that owed things, including many farmers and homeowners, saw a sharp rise in the real value of their debts. So you have the value of something, the nominal value, the number that is stated in terms of value in contracts or whatever, the nominal value, divided by the price level. So if you have the price level going down, then the value of that nominal value explodes, right? You're dividing a number that's not changing by a smaller number, and so the result is you get a bigger number. So therefore, the real value of loans became huge, and so it became nearly impossible for people to pay their loans back, especially during a depressed economy where it was hard to just have a job or have any kind of income. So this led to widespread bankruptcy and helped create a banking crisis as lenders found their customers unable to pay back their loans. Quick multiple choice question, nominal versus the real rate of interest. So suppose that the nominal interest rate is 7% and the inflation rate is 3%. The real rate of interest is then equal to 10%, 7%, 4%, or 3%. How many of you think it's 10%? 7%? 4%? Oh, 3%? All right. All right, so remember, the real rate of interest is equal to the interest rate minus the rate of inflation, right? The nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. We just covered that for those of you that walked in a little bit late. Just to let you know, I don't want you to forget because it's an important concept. You should know it. So again, the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation is equal to the real interest rate. Again, an interest rate that adjusts for the price level, adjusts for changing prices, real. So the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So here you've got the nominal being 7, the rate of inflation being 3, which equals then 4. And the inflation rate is the difference between the price level at some time period minus the price level at some base time period as a fraction of the price level in the base time period. All right, and then there's this thing. So deflation is when the price level is going down, and inflation is when the price level is going up. Disinflation is the process of trying to get the inflation rate down if the inflation rate is really high. So there's not much evidence that a rise in the inflation rate from, for example, 2 to 5% would do a great deal of harm to the economy. Still, policymakers generally move forcefully to bring inflation back down whenever it creeps above like 2 or 3%. That's sort of like a policy goal. So this process is called disinflation, the process of bringing down the inflation rate. Experience shows that bringing the inflation rate down is very difficult and costly once a higher rate of inflation has become well established in the economy. So the figure here shows what happened during 2 major episodes of disinflation in the United States in the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. So here is early 1980. We had a high rate of inflation. Here's 74, a high rate of inflation. In order to get to the low rate of inflation, so here's that solid blue line, in which it was initially at 10%, and then we got it down to 6%, and then over here it was initially at like roughly, 12, 13%, and then we got it down to about 4%. In order to do that, if we look at the inflation rate related to the unemployment rate, you see that in order to do that, we had to experience high levels of unemployment. So we had to like actively engage in depressing our economy to some extent, contracting it so that we can then bring down the price level because inflation was so high during those time periods. So disinflation can be a very painful process. So again, the figure shows what happened during the two major episodes of disinflation. Again, the horizontal axis is the unemployment rate. The vertical axis shows the core inflation over the previous year, a measure that excludes like volatile food and energy prices and is widely considered a better measure of underlying inflation than the overall consumer prices. Again, each marker represents the inflation rate and the unemployment rate for 1 month. In each episode, unemployment and inflation followed a sort of clockwise spiral with high inflation gradually falling in the face of extended periods of very high unemployment. All right, so we are done talking about inflation and unemployment finally. Let us move on to chapter 9. It's not a long chapter, so we should be able to cover it. It deals with long-run economic growth, the increasing capacity of a country to produce and really effectively modernize. So if you think about like the developed countries like us and the European countries and all the countries that are doing exceptionally well, like we experienced long-run economic growth for a very extended period over the last like 100 years or so, whereas a lot of other countries were left behind. So we'll talk about the reasons for that. We'll talk about the countries that were exceptions to that. We'll talk about the countries that are now experiencing like the kind of economic growth that's getting them closer to us. And we'll talk about like sort of the factors that affect these things and make our experiences different. So what we'll learn is why long-run economic growth is measured as the increase in real GDP per capita, how real GDP per capita has changed over time, and how it varies across countries. We'll learn why productivity is the key to long-run economic growth and how productivity is driven by physical capital, human capital, and technological progress. The factors that explain why long-run growth rates differ so much amongst countries. How growth has varied among several important regions of the world and why the convergence hypothesis applies to economically advanced countries. We'll talk about all these things. The question of sustainability and the challenges of growth posed by scarcity of natural resources and environmental degradation. So there is a cost to economic growth, obviously. We have a world that has a limited amount of resources and it needs to be protected in order for us to maintain at least the state we're at, but certainly to continue to grow. So that's a challenge that we're constantly facing. All right, let's compare economies across time and space. So let's talk about real GDP per capita again. Again, that is the measure that helps us to compare different countries, because if not, then you're just talking about like the amount that they can produce, and that doesn't really tell you the amount they can produce in relation to their population, therefore giving us an indication of like their living standards. Like, so again, real GDP per capita is the measure that we use to sort of compare countries and places across time. So although we also learn in chapter 7 that growth is in real GDP per capita should not be a policy goal in and of itself, it does serve as a very useful summary measure of a country's economic progress over time. So here we have real GDP per capita in 1990 dollars. So remember, that's the base year that's being used here, 1990 dollars. And that's the log scale. Don't worry about what that means. It's just a different way of looking at the same numbers. So here's the United States, real GDP per capita, steadily growing over time. Fairly stable growth. Obviously, Great Depression era, we had that go down a bit. World War II kind of led to a boom because whenever a country's at war, they're spending a lot of money, and that actually tends to accelerate their economies. We have China here. China, and the line for China is broken because we don't have like solid data for what was going on throughout that time. But we see that post 1970, there was like a pretty steady increase in GDP per capita. India as well, kind of leveled off, kind of leveled before that period, and then it started to increase post that period as well. So we'll talk about that. This is for the U.S. As a percentage of 1900 real GDP per capita, So if we look at real GDP per capita in 1900 as being 100%, we see that by 2010, the real GDP per capita has grown over sevenfold, over 7 times over the span of just like 100 years. So that again just reflects like the dramatic nature of the changes that our country and our world has experienced over the last like 150 years. Really, folks, like we are in a very unique time in human history, and it's really easy to like not see it and kind of just ignore it. But it is a really special time for us, and that's why when I say like opportunities, don't blow opportunities. Like we have an incredible amount of opportunities available to us, and if we're not taking them, if we're not really living in the moment and living in the state of the world that we're in now, then it's a very big missed opportunity. Very big. It's exciting. It's an exciting time. Here's a percentage of 2010 real GDP per capita, just looking at it differently, saying that, well, let's say 2010 is like kind of the base year. So 1900, then the real GDP per capita, each person then on average was producing and therefore had a value in the economy that was that they were sort of representative of. That was a very small percentage of what it is today for an individual. So again, dramatic changes over the last 150 years. And we experienced it gradually. Other countries that are called developing countries, or some of them have managed to accelerate their growth and start to catch up with us. So that's sort of like part of what we'll be talking about right now. So 50% of the world's population today lives in countries whose living standard is lower than the United States in 1900. So it's easy for us to sort of just be in our little bubble and kind of like ignore what we've got in relation to the rest of the world because it's just not right in front of us. But even if you compare the living standards of people like 110 years ago to everybody today, half of the world is still living in conditions worse than that. So there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen throughout the entire world. All right, so China has only recently exceeded the standard of living that the United States enjoyed in the early 20th century. India is still poorer than the United States was at that time. So in terms of GDP per capita, they're still kind of like waning as far as like their ability to catch up to even us back in the 1900s. So much of the world today is poorer than China or India. So these are two exceptions that demonstrate that they themselves who are experiencing growth are in not the greatest place. And then if you think about, well, there's a lot more of the world that's in even worse condition than they are, that's just another reason to really appreciate what we've got, what all of you have. Just us being in this room together is quite a privilege, yes. It does make sense. And that's actually what we're going to talk about. That's actually what this chapter is about, yeah. But if by the end I don't answer that question, ask it again. All right, so let's talk about growth rates. So long-run economic growth is normally a gradual process in which real GDP per capita grows at most a few percent per year. So from 1900 to 2013, real GDP per capita in the United States increased on average about 1.9% each year. Now, we use what's called the rule of 70 to identify how long it takes for a variable to double over time. So the rule of 70 tells us that the time it takes a variable that grows gradually over time to double is approximately 70 divided by that variable's annual growth rate. So the number of years for a variable to double is, again, 70 divided by the annual growth rate of the variable. Note that the rule of 70 can only be applied to a positive growth rate, because if you have a negative growth rate here, then you're going to get a negative value, which tells you that you would have to move back in time, which doesn't make sense. So if real GDP per capita grows at 1% a year, then it would take 70 years for real GDP to double. You just divide 70 by 1, and that tells you how long it would take. So if real GDP per capita grows at 2% per year, it will take 35 years to double. So we're just laying the foundation, tools, ideas to then answer the question that was asked. So again, 70, if you have a growth rate that's 2% per year, if you divide 70 by that, it tells us that then, let's say real GDP that's growing at 2% per year will double in 35 years. The moral is that small improvements add up, reflecting the power of compounding. So even though you might just be growing 1.9% a year, it compounds, right? So like the next year you have more that's being produced, and then that's growing at 1.9% a year. And then the next year you have that extra that's been produced the last 2 years, and then that's growing at 1.9% a year. So then that starts to balloon over time, and that is what gets you to for something to double so quickly. All right, since U.S. real GDP per capita rose on average 1.9% per year over the last century, if we divide 70 by 1.9%, it tells us that it took real GDP 37 years to double. So given the information that the rule of 70 implies, it would have taken 111 years, 3 periods of 37 years each, for the U.S. real GDP per capita to double 3 times. So just 2 times 2 times 2 tells us that it would have taken in order for it to increase eightfold, it would be 111 years, just based on the rule of 70. So this does turn out to be actually a pretty good approximation of reality. It's very close to what actually happened. So between 1899 and 2010, a period of 111 years, real GDP per capita rose just about eightfold. So the rule of 70 is actually a pretty solid way of like understanding these things, and therefore maybe even projecting when things might balloon. So here's the average annual growth rate of real GDP per capita from 1980 to 2013. In China, it was 7.6%. In India, it was 4.3%. Ireland, 3.1%. Us, 1.7%. France, 1.2%. Argentina, 0.88%. Zimbabwe, negative, unfortunately. To understand these differences in growth rate, we need to examine these sources of long-run economic growth. But just looking at these numbers, so like if you were to divide in China, if you were to divide, their 70 by their current growth rate of 7.6%, that's roughly 10 years. Like 10 years for the real GDP per capita to double. That's pretty much what's been happening, and it's pretty incredible. Like if you think about it, like the capacity of the economy to be able to double over a 10-year period, that will completely change like the state of everybody's life in that country, and it has. And so these are like the big stories of like what's happening, like China and India. These are like the big stories of what's happening right now as far as like crazy growth and like big advances in certain economies. Yeah. No, this is just for well, it's like kind of like an average over 1980 to 2013. So like an average, yeah, yeah. So it's like fluctuated around 7.6%. All right, but let's look at the sources that that then make a country have that kind of growth versus one that doesn't. But before that, let's do a quick short answer question that could potentially be on the exam. Rule of 70. So the accompanying table shows the average annual growth rates in real GDP per capita for Argentina, Ghana, and South Korea using data from the Penn World Table, version 6.2 from the past few decades. So here you've got the years, so 1960 to 1970, 1970 to 1980, and so on. Here's Argentina over this period. This was its average annual growth rate of GDP from 1960 to 1970. Ghana, same for that period. South Korea, same for that period. And of course, the same for the 3 countries across the 4 time periods that are being considered. For each decade and for each country, use the rule of 70 where possible to calculate how long it would take for that country's real GDP per capita to double. So that's something that I could potentially ask you to do. So obviously, you would do what here? You would divide 70 by each number. You would divide 70 by each number, and then that would tell you how long it would take for a country's GDP per capita to double? Yeah. 2.53, just like straight, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So the negative number wouldn't apply, right? Nothing. Right, yeah, like you would have a table, yeah. 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 Using the rule of 70. So if you divide 70 by a country's growth rate, it tells you how long it would take their GDP to double. Yeah, right. No, you would have 4 different answers. Well, I guess, well, yeah, 3. You're right. Exactly. Right. Part B. Suppose that the average annual, so these are calculations you should probably practice. Suppose that average annual growth rate that each country achieved over the period from 1990 to 2000 continues indefinitely into the future. Starting from 2000, use the rule of 70 to calculate where possible the year in which each country will have doubled its real GDP per capita. So again, you're going to use the growth rate from the period that it's telling you, right? So in this case, like Argentina, you would figure out, okay, 70 divided by 3.83, that's going to tell me how many years it's going to take for Argentina's real GDP per capita to double, right? And then it says, starting from 2000, how long would it be? So then you would add those years to 2000, and then you would say, well, it would be in the year 2000, whatever. That's when their GDP per capita would double. Yeah. Right. Right. You would add, no, you would pick the range's value of their growth rate that then told you how long it would take based on that growth rate for its. No, you would it's telling you here starting from 2000. Yeah, yeah. Another part of the exam that's going to be important is like being very careful about what it asks you to do, because that can usually trump you up if you go beyond what it's telling you to do. No. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you round like weird. I'll know what you're doing as long as you demonstrate that you understand the rule of 70. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. No. It's saying starting from 2000, use the rule of 70 to calculate where possible the year in which a country will have doubled its real GDP per capita. So you're going to figure out based on the rule of 70 how long it's going to take the real GDP per capita to double, and then you're going to add that to 2000, and then you're going to tell me what year their GDP per capita will double based on what the rule of 70 told us. Potentially, if this is on the exam. Yeah, exactly. I see. You're thinking that it's all one thing. No, individually. Yeah, exactly. How long? Like, what year will Argentina's GDP per capita double? What year will Ghana? What year will South Korea? Based on the rule of 70 and based on the range that I identify. All right. So this is what we figured out based on for part A. And then, so again, for using 1990 to 2000, then Argentina would be 2018, right? And then Ghana would be 2033, and then South Korea would be 2011. And that's what I have down here. Argentina 2018, Ghana 2033, and South Korea 2011. All right, let's talk about the sources of long-run growth. Long-run economic growth depends entirely on one ingredient, and that is rising productivity. So a number of factors affect the growth of productivity. So let's talk about the crucial importance of productivity. Productivity is actually what we're talking about is labor productivity. And we simply refer to it as productivity and its output per worker, how much each worker can produce. So for the economy as a whole, productivity, output per worker, is simply real GDP divided by the number of people working. So over the long run, the rate of employment growth is never very different from the rate of population growth. So in general, overall real GDP can grow because of population growth. Any large increase in real GDP per capita must be the result of higher productivity rather than an increased population of workers. So again, because the population is growing, that means the labor force is growing. That means it's not the productivity that is being affected. It's not productivity that is being affected by the growth of the population. The productivity is being affected by other things. So let's talk about growth in productivity. There are three main reasons why the average U.S. worker today produces far more than her or his counterpart a century ago. So the first reason is increase in physical capital. So remember when we were talking about the inputs into production that then resulted in payments to households from the firms. One of the things that was being paid to the households from the firms was a rent payments, and those were rent payments for physical capital. So in the circular flow diagram, we assume households owned the factors of production and that firms bought them from them. And then everything that's produced has a value, right? All final goods and services have a value, and they're spending on that value, and then that spending becomes somebody's income, right? So then that income gets channeled to households in the form of rent, interest payments, profits, and one other thing, wages, I think. So the increase in physical capital is an increase in one of these factors of production that are rented to the firms, and it is one of the reasons why we have increased labor productivity, which again is an increase in productivity. That's just the way we say it, and it is the main reason why there is differences in growth rate across countries. So physical capital consists of human-made resources such as buildings and machines. The average U.S. private sector worker today is backed up by more than $150,000 worth of physical capital, far more than a U.S. worker had 100 years ago, and far more than the average worker in most countries today. All right. The second source of differences in productivity is an increase in human capital. So we talked about how human capital is basically the capital that we all generate by learning new skills. Being in college, you are generating human capital for yourselves. So human capital is the improvement in labor created by the education and knowledge embodied in the workforce. In 1910, only 13.5% of Americans over 25 had graduated from high school, and only 3% had four-year college degrees. By 2010, the percentages were 87% and 30% respectively. Still not a lot of folks with college degrees, but definitely a major improvement. Nonetheless, it is very clear that the amount of human capital in our population has increased dramatically as a percentage of the overall population, which again is a severe catalyst for increased productivity, which then leads to increased growth. And of course, the third one is technological progress, maybe the most important. So technological progress is an advance in the technical means of the production of goods and services. We've had several industrial revolutions throughout the last 150 years or so, a couple of them occurring in the 1800s, and definitely a big one happening about 20 years ago. The digital revolution is an industrial revolution. So probably it is the most important driver of productivity growth. Economically important technological progress need not be flashy or rely on cutting-edge science. It could just be like a simple automated assembly line that is itself just enough to change the nature of what's being produced and how much is being produced per hour, so labor productivity. All right, so a way of accounting for growth, the various sort of sources of growth, is to look at what's called the aggregate production function. So aggregate, again, is sort of like the sum whole. So this production function is sort of captures like the overall capacity of an economy to produce given the amount of labor it has. So productivity is higher, other things equal, when workers are equipped with more physical capital, more human capital, and any combination, and of course better technology, and of course any combination of the three. So the aggregate production function is a hypothetical function that shows how productivity, which is real GDP per worker, depends on the quantities of physical capital per worker and human capital per worker, as well as the state of technology. So it's sort of a way to capture the relationships that exist between these sources that then allow us to engage in economic growth. So again, it allows economists to disentangle the effects of these three factors on overall productivity. An example of an aggregate production function applied to real data comes from a comparative study of Chinese and Indian economic growth by the economists Barry Bosworth and Susan Collins of the Brookings Institution. Don't worry, you don't have to know these people. So they related GDP per worker to the physical capital per worker and the human capital per worker. So the amount of physical capital per worker was raised to the power of 0.4, human capital per worker raised to the power of 0.6, and then it's multiplied by T, and T represents an estimate of the level of technology. They assume that each year of education raises workers' human capacity by 7%. So the human capital per worker had that impact based on this relationship that they studied and the data that they looked at. Using this function, they try to explain why China grew faster than India between 1978 and 2004. They found that about half the difference was due to China's higher level of investment spending. Investment spending is what leads to increased capital, physical capital. Again, which raised its level of physical capital per worker faster than India's. The other half was due to faster Chinese technological progress. So here we're going to see a graphical representation of this aggregate production function. In analyzing historical economic growth, economists have discovered a crucial fact about the estimated aggregate production function. It exhibits diminishing returns to physical capital. Diminishing returns to physical capital means that when holding the amount of human capital per worker and the state of technology fixed, so remember, it's those three factors that affect labor productivity. It's the physical capital per worker, the human capital per worker, and the level of technology. What this relationship will demonstrate, this curve will demonstrate, is the relationship between real GDP per worker, so labor productivity, as a function of the physical capital per worker. So we're just looking at that relationship in the curve. And if the curve is shifting, then what's causing the curve to shift is the amount of technology in the economy or the human capital, because that's not part of the relationship that's being graphed. Just like with the model, this is a model, by the way. So just like the supply and demand model, you have the relationship between price and quantity. And that relationship was embodying in those lines, right? The quantity demanded versus price is the demand function, and the quantity supplied in relation to price was the supply function. And if there were changes in prices, you just moved along those lines. But if something else was changing in the economy, or in those markets, then it shifted the entire relationship. So if you had like incomes increase in a population for whatever reason, then for a good at any given price, people were demanding more. So that shifted the demand curve to the right? So again, the curves are a very specific relationship that's being studied, but it doesn't mean that those relationships can't be analyzed in relation to other things. And when they are studied in relation to other things, it changes like the position of the curves that embody the original relationship we're studying. So again, the production function, the aggregate production function, looks at the productivity of workers, the real GDP per worker, as a function of how much physical capital per worker there is. But we also know that productivity is affected by the level of human capital and the state of technology. And so those are the things that are going to shift the production function. Now, the fact that there's diminishing returns to capital means that when holding the amount of human capital and the state of technology fixed, so those two other things that affect productivity, let's hold them fixed for a second. Each successive increase in the amount of physical capital per worker leads to a smaller increase in productivity. And therefore, the curve is going to look like this. It's going to have a positive slope. It's going to be a positive relation, meaning that as you increase physical capital, then labor productivity increases. So that's definitely something that you can see. But we can see that that effect starts to level off as you increase the amount of physical capital, meaning that the first $20,000 of physical capital going from having no physical capital will increase labor productivity quite a bit. In fact, by 30,000 here. But if you increase the amount of physical capital per worker, let's say by another $30,000, that's only going to increase the amount of productivity per worker by another $20,000. So there's a diminishing return to physical capital that's embodied in this relationship that just captures a natural characteristic of this relationship in the world. And that's what models try to do. They simplify the world, but they try to capture as much complexity as possible in like the nuances of it. So capital in the hands of those that did not have any will make a big difference in productivity. More expensive capital will only improve on that productivity and not have the same impact. So if workers are over here and they have all sorts of physical capital, almost 70,000, you give them a little bit more, it's not going to help them too much, right? So there are diminishing returns to physical capital. So again, this is the aggregate production function that we're seeing. It is a relationship between real GDP per worker, labor productivity, and the amount of physical capital per worker that exists in the technology. It's a positive relationship, but it has diminishing returns embodied in it. Diminishing returns to physical capital is an other things equal phenomenon. Diminishing returns may disappear if we increase the amount of human capital per worker or improve the technology, or both at the same time. The amount of physical capital per worker is increased. In practice, all the factors contributing to higher productivity rise during the course of economic growth. So growth accounting is the method we use to estimate the contribution of each of these major factors in the aggregate production to economic growth. So we try to sort of disentangle these effects when like the economy is growing. Well, is the economy growing because of increase in human capital, increase in physical capital, or increase in technology? Well, it's all three of them. But how much are each of them having an impact? If we can understand that relationship, then maybe we can look at developing countries and say, well, then we need to adjust, this level of human capital, this level of technology, and maybe help them grow faster by making these adjustments. So growth accounting allows us to calculate the effects of greater physical and human capital on economic growth. The effects of technological progress are estimated from what's left over after the effects of physical and human capital have taken into account. So suppose there was no increase in human capital per worker, so that we can focus on changes just in physical capital and in technology. So assume that between, let's say, 1940 and 2010, the amount of physical capital per worker rose, in this case, from 20,000 to 60,000. So over that time period, we would simply look along the aggregate production function to track what's happening to labor productivity over that period. Well, we can see that from 20,000 to 60,000, labor productivity rose from 30 to 60,000. So labor productivity doubled as a result of us increasing our physical capital threefold over that period. So that growth accounting and using the aggregate production function has allowed us to identify that. Without any technological progress, the economy has moved from A to C. So remember, we're holding human capital changes constant, so we're not even thinking about that. We're just looking at the effects of changes in physical capital and the effects of changes in technology on the effects of labor productivity. We're trying to disentangle the effects of both of them. In reality, though, there was an increase in both physical capital per worker and technological progress, which shifted the aggregate production function. So the fact that the aggregate production function shifted is a result of something other than an increase in physical capital, because that would only cause a movement along the aggregate production function. But because the level of technology increased, that means that at a level of 60,000 physical capital per worker, before we were able to produce $60,000 worth of GDP per worker, but now we're able to produce $120,000 per worker. And so then that shift of that point has to be due to technological progress, because it's not due to physical capital per worker changing, because that would just be a movement along it, and it's not due to human capital changing, because we assume that that is not changing. What this curve tracks is what's also called total factor productivity, the amount of output that can be achieved with a given amount of factor inputs. When total factor productivity increases, the economy can produce more output with the same quantity of physical capital, human capital, and labor. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, again, this bureau that does a lot of analysis for the economy, estimates the growth rate of both labor productivity and total factor productivity for, let's say, non-farm businesses in the United States. Over the period from 1948 to 2010, American labor productivity rose 2.3% per year. Only 49% of that rise is explained by increases in physical and human capital. And therefore, the residual, the leftover, must be due then to the increase in technological means. So again, the rest is explained by rising total factor productivity, which is technological progress. All right, so what about natural resources? So obviously, if you are in a country that's endowed with a lot of land, then that's going to provide you with a lot more resources to produce than a country that maybe has a bunch of lakes and not a lot of land, and so that could affect you. So in the modern world, natural resources are a much less important determinant of productivity than human or physical capital for the great majority of countries. Some nations with very high real GDP per capita, such as Japan, have very few natural resources. Some resource-rich nations, such as Nigeria, which has sizable oil deposits, are very poor. So it's not necessarily natural resources that are responsible, and that's why we don't take them into account when we do our growth accounting. So again, understand the production function, understand the things that affect our productivity, understand that technological progress is what increases total factor productivity, understand what shifts the curve and the relationship that the curve is embodying, and the difference between movements from 2 points on the curve versus a movement from a point on the curve to a point above the curve that has shifted. Understand what all that is. Be able to explain it, be able to identify it and grasp. Some of the homework problems will deal with it as well, which, by the way, I opened up a couple of days ago. So if you've seen it already, it's been there. But it's available for you to do immediately, so you can get that out of the way so you can then focus on studying for the next exam. All right, let's talk about why growth rates differ. So explaining differences in growth rates. Economies with rapid growth tend to be economies that add physical capital, increase their human capital, and experience rapid technological progress. So the things that allow for those three things to change are the things that will be examined right now. The first, of course, is savings and investment spending. So in the 1960s, Japan was the fastest growing major economy. It also spent a much higher share of its GDP on investment goods than other major economies. Today, China is the fastest growing major economy, and it similarly spends a very large share of its GDP on investment goods. In 2014, investment spending was 48% of China's GDP, compared with only 20% in the United States. So the money for investment spending comes primarily from savings, right? So folks put their money in banks, and then banks lend those funds out. We saw that in the circular flow diagram, and that is what you need in order to be able to invest in a lot of the capital goods that you need to experience growth in productivity. So foreign capital has played an important role in the long-run economic growth of some countries, including the United States, which relied heavily on foreign funds during its early industrialization. So remember, we had the rest of the world in the circular flow diagram, and we saw that they were also depositing their funds in our financial institutions, either by buying our bonds or buying our stocks, and therefore, allowing us to then use that money to invest domestically to be used for investment spending. And of course, that is the case for every country. And the more open that a country is to these sorts of financial investors, like the more likely that they will be to experience the type of growth that they need in order to modernize. But you need stability within the country in order to be able to just even facilitate that kind of like financial system. Education is another one of these factors that affects the growth rates. So there have been large differences in the rate at which countries add to their human capital through education. So here we've got years of schooling. The blue bar is Argentina. The green bar is China. And China initially was losing here, but they increased quite a bit as far as their years of schooling. Argentina, they increased as well, but not in as large of a proportion. So in both China and Argentina, the average educational level has risen steadily over time, but has risen much faster in China. Today, the average educational level in China is still slightly below that of Argentina, but that's mainly because there are still many elderly adults who never receive basic education. All right, research and development is another factor that will help to increase the three sources of economic growth. So scientific advances obviously make new technologies possible. Research and development, or R&D, is spending to create and implement new technologies. Although some research and development is conducted by governments, much R&D is paid for by the private sectors, individual firms who are innovators. So the United States became the world's leading economy in large part because American businesses were amongst the first to make systematic research and development a part of their operations. So that became a focus for a lot of companies, whereas other companies are just focused on producing what they're good at. A lot of countries in the US they kind of buck the trend and change the nature of like what firms do, not just to produce, but also to innovate. So Thomas Edison created the first modern industrial research laboratory. Edison's Menlo Park lab is now a museum. It's in California. Some of the inventions from this lab include the incandescent light bulb and the electrical distribution system. So, change the world. The role of government in promoting economic growth. So government policies can help to spur the kind of activities that then are required to increase labor productivity and thus growth. And so let's look at some of these. So government policies can increase the economy's growth rate through four main channels. The first one is through government subsidies to infrastructure. So infrastructure include roads, power lines, ports, information networks, and other underpinnings for economic activity. Although some infrastructure is provided by private companies, much of it is either provided by the government or requires a great deal of government regulation and support. To provide good infrastructure, an economy must not only be able to afford it, but it must also have the political discipline to maintain it. These issues were slightly touched upon last night in the debate, if you watched it, which was very entertaining, by the way. Don't miss the next two. These things are like edge of your seat type things. Anyway, government subsidies to education is another way that the policies can affect growth. So again, human capital is a big factor in increasing labor productivity, which leads to growth. So much of the economy's human capital is the result of government spending on education. 75% of students attend public colleges and universities, and government significantly subsidized research performed at private colleges and universities. Differences in the rate at which countries add to their human capital largely reflect government policy. And then finally, government subsidies to research and development. So again, although private firms are actively working towards developing new means of just producing, etc., governments also play a big role in that. So in advanced countries, R&D is partly funded by the government. The internet actually grew out of a system, which is called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, ARPANET, created by the US Defense Department, then extended to educational institutions by the National Science Foundation. So without the government innovating as they did for initially military purposes, we wouldn't have the internet, which, as we all know, is our entire lives at this point. And finally, governments need to maintain a well-functioning financial system. So governments play an important role, an important indirect role in making high rates of private investment spending possible. A well-regulated and well-functioning financial system is very important for economic growth because in most countries, it is the principal way in which savings are channeled into investment spending. So if you don't have a system that's like well protected by a system of law and order that will allow for people to then say, oh, it's okay for me to put all my money in this country in order for, the industries to flourish or whatever, then that just won't happen. So, and that's actually pretty key in a lot of these developing countries, like the fact that they haven't developed, because there is so much corruption at every level that you cannot guarantee the safety of investments. So a well-functioning financial system requires appropriate government regulation to assure depositors that their funds are protected from loss. So this protection of property rights is a big issue. Property rights are the rights of owners of valuable items to dispose of those items as they choose. Intellectual property rights are the rights to accrue the rewards of an innovation. A patent is a government-created temporary monopoly given to an innovator for the use of his or her own innovation. It's temporary, though, because while it's in society's interest to give an innovator an incentive to invent, it's also in society's interest to eventually encourage competition. So these are actually some of the reasons why like trade pacts are so complicated and difficult to establish, is because like you not only have to establish, well, like who's going to produce what and at what prices, given like the whole comparative advantage stuff that we covered, but you also have to figure out like is intellectual property going to be protected? Like are the laws of a country going to protect the innovations that are then being exported to them? And so that's a big issue that then can get in the way of investment, because why would financial investors want to invest in a country where their innovations won't be protected, and therefore they won't be allowed at least a guaranteed like income stream for a certain amount of time, allowed by the length of the patent. Political stability and good governance play a big role also in the stability of a country and the ability to be confident about savings being protected and investment being also protected. So political stability and good governance, including the protection of property rights, are essential ingredients in fostering economic growth in the long run. The law must say that your property is really yours so that someone else cannot take it away, right? The courts and the police must be honest so that they can't be bribed in order to ignore the law. So that's obviously a big hurdle in a lot of developing countries. The political system must be stable so that the laws don't change capriciously. Excessive government intervention, though, can be a brake on economic growth. So there is sort of a balancing act that needs to be played with respect to like how much engagement a government should take into like these economic transactions that will ideally protect investors, but potentially maybe just become too immersive, which could then stop like markets from doing what they naturally do. So let's talk about success, disappointment, and failure overall in the world as far as like growth. So we can focus on a few examples here. South Korea, Argentina, and Nigeria. Here's real GDP per capita over the range of 1960 to 2013. South Korea's amazing rise here. So we have a steady rise here, whereas Argentina is pretty flat, Nigeria is pretty flat. So South Korea is part of a broad economic miracle, as it's called, in East Asia. Argentina's slow progress, interrupted by repeated setbacks, is more or less typical of the disappointing growth characterized by Latin American countries. And Nigeria's unhappy story until very recently, with little growth in real GDP until after 2010, was unfortunately an experience shared by many African countries. So these are good examples of the sort of the continents that were in sort of turbulent stages and maybe still in turbulent stages, but are either growing or maybe either have been growing like South Korea or are starting to grow like Nigeria. So let's talk about this East Asian miracle. South Korea's economic growth is unprecedented in human history. It took the country only 35 years to achieve growth that others took centuries to achieve. So high growth rates first appeared in South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, but then spread across the region and most notably now to China. Since 1975, the whole region has increased their real GDP per capita by 6% per year, more than 3 times the American historical rate of growth. So the growth can be attributed to the 3 sources mentioned. Again, human capital, physical capital, and technological progress. And again, you do that by very high savings rates. So that allowed for a lot of investment. Very good basic education, which allowed for an increase in human capital. And these countries have experienced substantial technological progress. Again, adapting major advances that other countries adapted over a small period of time all at once. The advances in technology from advanced economies were readily adapted to help growth. Many economists have suggested a general principle that can be extracted from the experience of this accelerated growth. They call it the convergence hypothesis. It basically states that international differences in real GDP per capita tend to narrow over time, so that eventually we are converging to a worldwide state of modernization. It says that differences in real GDP per capita among countries tends to narrow over time because countries that start with lower GDP per capita tend to have high growth rates. Let's talk about Latin America's disappointment. So that was like the East Asian miracle. Let's talk about Latin American countries, why they haven't been able to take off in the way that Asian countries have. So in 1900, Latin America was not considered an economically backward region. Last time I mentioned that as compared to Canada, who's basically at our level now, they were the same. They were the same state in 1900, and yet Argentina has not reached that level. So since about 1920, growth in Latin America has been very disappointing. The rates of savings and investment spending in Latin America have been much lower than in East Asia, partly as a result of irresponsible government policy that has eroded savings through very high inflation, bank failures, and other disruptions. So investment, again, key. If you aren't able to maintain a system that allows for investment to flourish, then your growth is going to be severely hampered. Education, especially broad basic education, has been underemphasized. Even Latin American nations rich in natural resources often fail to channel that wealth into their educational systems. And political instability, leading to irresponsible economic policies, has also taken a toll. And let's talk about Africa's troubles and promise. So on average, the countries are nowhere close to U.S. living standards 100 or even 200 years ago, unfortunately. Economic progress has been slow and uneven. The consequence of this poor growth performance has been intense and causing continuing poverty, which is sad, very sad. The first source of this poverty is sometimes attributed to political instability. Property rights are also a major problem. Some economists argue that the country is politically unstable because of poverty. Being landlocked and the susceptibility of disease is pointed to as a source for that. All right, so let's talk about the final topic, like is growth sustainable overall? So sustainable long-run economic growth is long-run growth that can continue in the face of the limited supply of natural resources and the impact of growth on the environment. Natural resources and growth revisited. So there are differing views of the impact of limited natural resources on long-run economic growth. So here is real domestic U.S. oil price. over the last sort of 60 years, and we see it's been relatively stable except for this weird sort of period in the 1970s, and now it's kind of like ballooning. So there is uncertainty with respect to the actual supply of resources. They talk about like oil, like us kind of having reached what's called peak oil, where it's like we've tapped into all the major sources, and that we may actually be on a decline as far as like our ability to continue to use it as like our staple energy source, which is good. We should be using other sources, of course. Whether or not technology is able to find alternatives to natural resources is also uncertain, though. Economists, though, we are optimistic. They believe that modern economies can find a way to work around limits on the supply of natural resources. There are incentives to innovate, and if there is demand for an alternative source, then there will be a way to create those sources or perpetuate the sources that we already know exist, but are not popular yet because obviously the dominance of oil. So scarcity will lead to rationing high prices and incentives to find alternatives, right? So as the supply of oil decreases, right? So here's the demand and here's the supply. The supply goes down, then the price will go up, right? Equilibrium price will go up, and that will just cause people to look for substitutes, right? Just basic functions of a market that we studied in chapter 3. And so that incentive will cause us to improve our innovations and allow them to proliferate as alternatives to using the existing sources of oil. So after the sharp oil price increases of the 1970s, American consumers turned to smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, and U.S. industry also greatly intensified its efforts to reduce energy bills. So we see oil consumption slightly started to level off during the last 30 years. So after 1973, the U.S. economy continued to deliver growth in real GDP per capita, even as it substantially reduced the use of oil. Economic growth in the environment. Economic growth tends to increase the human impact on the environment. We see here's carbon dioxide emissions in China post 1970. It's ridiculous. It's ballooned. That's one of the big issues that we have with China, trying to get them to control their emissions, given that they have industrialized so quickly. So unlike resource scarcity, environmental problems don't automatically provide incentives for change behavior, unfortunately. There is broad consensus amongst economists that government action is needed to deal with climate change, and so that's what will happen. All right, folks, we are done with the first part of the course. Congratulations, you made it to this point. Now you've got a week ahead of you. That, again, is an opportunity. Do not blow it. I want to see A's on all of your papers next week. And have a good week, all right?